Hi everyone. Let's get started. And the first thing I'm going to say is that, as you probably just heard, this session is being recorded. So just so you know. So welcome. Thanks for coming, and also thanks to the online attendees as well. And we're going to have a kind of a different session today. It's going to be great. And Lori Hawk is actually going to manage the session, so I'm just going to speak very briefly before I introduce her and hand over to Lori. But before I do that, for those who aren't familiar, this is the Working with PIDs in Tools interest group. We have 4 co-chairs, and one of them is Xiaoli Chan, is on the call. The other 2 aren't here today. And as the kind of title implies, the reason that we formed this group was that to remind people that PIDs are not used in a vacuum, and they aren't sent down from heaven, and they are, or they should be, used by researchers and curators in a context which is likely to involve research tools. And incorporating PIDs into research tools and the workflows that research tools support is not a trivial matter. So that's really the focus of this group, is to highlight that fact and to explore particular use cases which relate to those issues. And we have a pretty fairly broad and kind of random approach. It's an interest group, it's not a working group. So each time we select a topic around that general area that we think will be of interest to the community, and try to further also explore that area. So with that as background, today we're taking a different approach. We're always up for anything new. And really we're just kind of providing a forum, if you will, for Lori to run a session on a topic which is I think of considerable interest, and I assume pretty much everybody who's in the room and also online is already aware of, which is this emerging issue of PIDs for facilities. So, and with that as background, I don't think I have much more to say. And Lori, I'm going to hand over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Rory, for that introduction. And thanks, Rory and Xiaoli and this interest group for hosting this conversation. So just a little bit of background. I know there's been a number of different conversations about persistent identifiers for facilities and resources. This is carrying forth the conversation from an unconference session at PIDFest earlier this year. The idea was to try to, engage as many communities as we can to tease out and maybe move forward some of these discussions so that as people are working with facilities and resources, that there's a little bit more guidance and agreement in the community about how and which PIDs to use. So that's where we're starting. So I'm trying to act kind of as a messenger or facilitator for group conversations and carry a message rather than deliver a message. So with that in mind, I've put a link in the chat. These are open slides. They're really, I would prefer to do this in a mirror board, but I figured a Google Doc, Google Slides would probably be easier for folks in this venue. Please add comments to the slides, add comments to the chat. Add comments if you're in the room. Please use the microphone so other people on the online can hear. And I do apologize. I'm in an airport and there's announcements. I don't know if you can hear them. Hopefully you can't. So I'm just going to apologize for the background noise. So starting off, PIDs for facilities. Just so you understand kind of the structure of this call today. This is a working session. We don't have a lot of slides. The slides are interactive. There's a link in the chat, as I just mentioned. I talked a little bit about the background. There are several RDA working groups active in developing frameworks about the continuum of tools you use, including this one here. It ranges from samples to resources to instruments to facilities to organizations, and that's not a straight line. There's a lot of recursiveness going on in there. And as we're implementing these frameworks for persistent identifiers, there's a lot of questions about specifications, and especially at the fuzzy borders between things, like what's a resource versus an instrument? Is a resource a facility? Is it instrument facility? And that's, I think, where we run into these questions. And And folks who work with persistent identifiers like to be precise. And so, this really is, how precise do we need to be, and what level of fuzziness is okay in this community, and how can we accommodate that level of fuzziness at the borders? And we have to realize that there are, some places where it's like, oh, this is perfectly clear, and I think I know how this works. And I have to admit, every once in a while, I walk into a room saying, this is all really clear, and then you start talking to people, and you realize that actually it's really not. If you're in one disciplinary field, or work with certain kinds of instruments or equipment, it's really, really not clear versus others where it is clear. So today it's really, can we surface where the fuzziness exists, and kind of go from there. So we have three sections to the conversation today. The first one is we're going to be looking at use cases, and Adam File-Smith is in the room, and I have his slides, so he's going to take us through an example of one use case. And following that, we are going to go into that kind of slide on use cases. And if folks could just share some ideas, if you want to go ahead to the next slide and start typing stuff in, please go ahead. And we can make sure that we collect use cases. Why do people want to use persistent identifiers for facilities? And I think that will then help to help us understand kind of what persistent identifiers are, make the most sense. The second one that we're going to go into is, like, once we understand the use cases for facilities, we can start to talk about how we actually define what a facility is. And I think those definitions are going to depend on the use case. So enter more fuzziness. And then the third piece of this today is, like, what PID or PIDs should we be using for facilities. And again, I really think that as we go from 1 to 2 to 3, the fuzziness is going to increase. But there's also opportunities in there both for creativity and flexibility. Then the last piece, I think, is really also to determine, do we have enough information now for folks to kind of take the next step in their own context? Or is it a useful next step for this working group or another one to spin up, this interest group or another one to spin up and sponsor an RDA working group to gather a little bit more community information and either answer these questions or develop a framework or set of recommendations for folks working in this space. So does anybody have any questions before or suggestions before we launch into the rest of this presentation? I'm looking for hands. No hands in the room. All right. If you do, I see a number of you in the room or online. Again, please feel free to use the group chat. I'm checking the chat. I don't see anything. So we're going to go forward. The next piece here is why do we want or need facility identifiers? And Adam, go find the microphone. I'm going to find your slide. So I got to stop this share and start a new one. So give me a second. While you're coming up, I will do that. Hang on a sec. Slides here. Gosh, it's super loud in here. I'm so sorry. I'm going to mute myself, Adam, while you're talking. Hang on a second. I was on mute. Where are you? I lost my share screen button. Here we go. All right. I think everyone can see that. So there you go. Here's your screen and your dance, Adam. Go ahead and tell us about your use case.
Cool. So thanks very much. And hi, I'm Adam Vilesmoor, JISC in the UK. And I've just thought it would be useful to talk about equipment.data, which is the asset register for the UK for the kind of like wider equipment across many different institutions. So if we go to the next slide, please. Thank you.
Maybe.
Maybe.
There we go. Next slide.
Hey, well done. So the service has been running for quite a while, and the idea is that institutions create some kind of a register. In the last phase, which finished about a year ago, they were using a metadata profile called Uniquip. They would create a Uniquip file, which was then uploaded to the service, and then that had a list of the things that were there. So it was partly about kind of like complying with funder policies. We've given you £2 million for a synchrotron, we've given you £500,000 to refit out a lab. Maybe other people want to use that, so we don't have to spend another £2 million on it, so they can use this national asset registry to find that. The idea was, again, like this kind of like simple, better, which I don't know if you've heard from the UK, but encouraging these efficiencies and collaborations as well. Hey, we're using that kind of instrument, and that's something that we're doing. We can either go and use the equipment at your facility, or we can talk about the kind of things that we're doing together. So if we go to the next slide. Perfect. I don't know how well you can read this. I will, at this point, say that I am one of the kind of like advisors on equipment.data rather than the product owners. So if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer, and otherwise I'll push it on to the people who are at the end of the slide deck. So we're kind of like working through updating this service and trying to make it both more useful in the kind of national context, but also kind of more widely as well. So these really difficult to read bullet points here are around kind of like building data management areas that, and this is the bit we go, synchronize with PIDs. So instead of having a Uniquip ID in equipment.data and then not really, again, existing outside of that registry, we're working to create a data site DOI with a PIDs profile for the equipment. So we've mapped Uniquip to PIDs and then created additional fields. And then that has been work we're doing with the institutions to change the way that they generate and capture that information. So we're both getting better and more complete information, but we're also then exposing that information, not just in the equipment registry, but also in the global open registries that we get with persistent identifiers. We are also currently in discussions with, and no booing please, Pure and Elsevier about kind of adding those equipments as part of the current research information system, so that you can actually, as part of the research output, you can tag the equipment in the registry. And again, this is giving more kind of like information about reproducibility. It's giving more information that allows you kind of understand the environmental context of the research that's being performed. Longer term, we're kind of looking towards promoting that CRIS as a source of truth for research institutions. So where you have the facilities and ability to have a CRIS, then that CRIS will be a place where the information lives. And so instead of having like a separate way of generating some kind of asset register, that will be part of the information systems inside the institution. And again, that's something that is kind of ongoing. And also, we've got this bottom bit at the minute, which says explore requirement and feasibility for adjacent services. So this is something both looking at things like the RAID identifier, the research activity identifier for, again, pulling all of these things together into a narrative about the process of the research and about moving that information and contextualizing it. Next slide, please. So, it's all really simple, and we've done it all right. No, so this slide I think is really helpful in kind of informing the rest of the kind of discussion we're having today. So, yeah, researchers, the people in charge of the institutions, and the funders, including the funder who provided the funding to update this, thank you, that's awesome, don't have kind of like variable awareness of what a persistent identifier is and whether or not you could create something for a physical thing and also how that would work. So even though we are doing this work, basically in the kind of like request of a major UK funder, them and some of the other funders in UK and in this area are kind of going, oh, that's really interesting. I guess in the next 5 to 10 years when we have something running, that might be something we could really do with looking at. No, we're doing it now. The alignment of those CRIS, again, current research information system, equipment modules with PIDs, so where they already have like a model metadata for equipment, which isn't the same as either Uniquip or PIDs, we've got to try and kind of align and map those or work within product life cycles. We've got to integrate those persistent identifiers with other systems. So, whenever you're adding the equipment that they maintain to their ORCID profile, that kind of thing is, again, something we're working with, and how we integrate them into the researcher workflow. So, like, do we put them into research notebooks? Again, that ability to provide more context throughout the process. And the final challenge is that simplifying and automating of the collection itself. So where do we get the information about the instruments? How does that flow through the system? How do we do updates and versioning and all of that kind of thing? So that's a list of exciting things to do. And the next slide is just the perfect, thank you. These are the product owners. So if you know Jisk Balvier, who used to run the Orca Consortium and now runs equipment.data, and John, who's head of product in the research systems at Jisk. So those are the people to ask long and detailed questions, but I'm happy to contribute throughout the rest of this as much as I can. Okay, thanks, Laurie.
Thanks, Adam. All right, any questions about that while we're here and have the slides up? I'm looking online for hands. I'm trying to see in the room. Anybody have one?
They were overwhelmed with joy.
We got a loquacious group today. All right, let me hit the stop share. We're going to flip back to my slides. Give me just a second. Oh, the back and forth screen is share. Here we are. Oh, share. Thanks for your patience, everybody, with this. All righty. Okay, so I see a number of you are here in there. So we've got, why do we want or need facilities IDs? And I think, if I were going to add something out of your talk, it would be to connect in with equipment as well, right? Does that sound fair?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I'm looking for, folks to throw some stuff into, not throw, but to carefully think and write some notes or add some comments in the room. We've got some use cases, and I know these are very, very high level use cases, thinking about why people might want a facility identifier. It could be because it's part of their facility application process. I understand that not all facilities have an application process. Some facilities, kind of to Adam's point, would like to be able to track users, like who's applying, but who is using the facility. A lot are trying to look at tracking outputs and outcomes, like what is the impact of this facility on the research process. There's also, these are all interleaved, getting credit for the research that the facility helps to support. And then again, that comes back to justifications for ongoing budget, for example. There's also one Rory brought up, which was incorporating information about research facilities into documentation. And this also kind of fits into what Adam was just saying about, hey, equipment often, but not always, is part of the facility. And so having that facility identifier is a way to bring together groups of equipment or tools, instruments that are used for the furtherance of research. So, there we go, tracking impact. So right away, if you would like to put it in chat, if you want to put it in the slides, if anyone's having trouble accessing the slides, please let me know. We are talking, so if folks would like to chat or explain or dig into anything, unmute or grab the microphone, and I'm going to sit on this slide for just a few minutes. So if we want to do it quietly, that's fine. If people want to talk, that's fine. But I'll give you let's take about 5 minutes here and make sure that we're trying to capture some of these use cases. We have some music. That's awesome. All right, I'm not seeing a lot more activity. Maybe what would be helpful is for folks to kind of put a little asterisk or some kind of notation next to each one of these if they are pertinent to how you are thinking about facilities identifiers. So we can kind of get a sense of, is managing applications something on the edge of the folks that are in this group, or, something. So if you've got just add an asterisk or I don't care, a greater than sign, whatever it is, just add something right over here by the bullet. Like here, I'm going to put an asterisk. And then we'll just kind of get a list of, like, if there's a lot of asterisks there, we know that's a major use case that we need to be paying attention to. So we got another couple minutes here. Just take your time, go put that stuff in. That'd be helpful. And if you don't feel like using the slides, it's okay to get the microphone and just say, hey, this one, put an asterisk there. It's okay to talk. You don't have to be online. Awesome. Nice addition, thanks. Any other asterisks? People are in the room just because they love Adam. All right, one more minute, and then I'm moving on to the next piece, which is looking at how we define facilities. And David, thanks for sharing the URLs. Really helpful. Thanks a lot. Okay. All right, so we're going to move to the next piece. So we've talked about some use cases. I haven't gotten a lot of you to add things, so we're just going to say these are all equally important to people. The next piece here, oh, we got some more movement. Yay, tracking impact. The next piece is really thinking about how do we define a facility. And so again, these really kind of depends upon the use cases we have. I think the easiest yes about what is a facility are these large, in my case, living in the United States, something like Oak Ridge National Lab is an example of a facility. There's also observatories. There's permanent installations like these, like CERN, that could be defined as facilities. And so I wrote a bunch of other ideas and examples in the boxes to the left of that. And the question for this group is like, where do these fit, right? So when we were at PIDFest earlier this year, the question came up, well, yeah, clearly Oak Ridge is a national lab, is a facility, but it also has a bunch of things within it, like beam lines, or special things that people still apply for a beam line at Oak Ridge, not just to come to Oak Ridge. So does the beam line count as a facility, or is that a sub something? And so where do we think about facilities? So there you go. Please add some other examples. I can put some pieces here, Control V, a whole bunch of these puppies, add away if you have some other examples. And then if you see something here, my dictionary is overactive. How do I get out of the dictionary? We can say on this neutron, there you go. And so you would consider this, we'll put this in the yes section here as a facility. Is there anything here that you see that is just like, yeah, no, that's really not a facility. I think that is a piece of equipment, for example. Let's try to sort through that and think through that today. So when we're talking about persistent identifiers, that as we're thinking about those, that we have a sense of what we're talking about, both in terms of those use cases, but also in terms of what we're talking about when we mean facility. Right. And I see somebody put in equipment versus facility or both. That's exactly the point, right? And when we start talking about persistent identifiers, that matters, right? Is something a piece of equipment that is at a facility, or can you have a facility with other facilities within it? And kind of there's all this fuzziness based on the use cases. What is it that we're trying to track? And do we have certain classes or availabilities of persistent identifiers that make sense in different kind of parts of this continuum? And Rolf, I see you in the room. If you want to get on the microphone and start talking, I encourage you to add your 2 cents into this. Yeah, so whoever wrote CERN data center, is that a facility or is that a maybe? Is that equipment? You just take drag and drop. Where do you think it should go? Yes, maybe, no. In terms of is it, there you go. Okay, it's a maybe. Okay. I'll put in some other examples. Feel free to move stuff around. Beamlines at Oak Ridge. That's how I felt about it too. I'm not sure. To go in both places. Okay. We're defining fuzziness. This is awesome. So what about things like core instrumentation facilities? So this is where you would have like a center at a university. So it's not the university, it's a center at the university or a part of a department that offers an instrumentation core. Do folks consider that a facility or is that a maybe? That's, I think, where some of the biggest challenges, because folks like CERN, it's like, hey, I'm an organization, people can be affiliated with CERN, but you're not really necessarily affiliated with the core instrumentation lab. You use it, but it's not something that you would put in as a, as an author on a paper that I am affiliated, employed by this lab. So I don't know how folks think about that. You just slice. Okay. Yeah, it does not have to be neat. Stick it wherever. So we've got a couple things here. The OMIC, the HPC storage, is that a facility or is that equipment? Wow, there you go. No, very nice. He's doing great work here. No one's talking. I kind of missed the talking. Field station. Good point. Where does that go? I think that's a facility. Awesome. Great. Great. I'm glad to see it there.
Lori, could I throw out a
Yes.
question which just came into my mind? So right
Yes.
now thank you. Right now we're giving examples,
Uh-huh.
but one thing which could be done as a kind of second level exercise is to say, okay, now that we've got these examples, can we abstract out and say what are the properties what are the differential properties that might distinguish a piece of equipment from a facility? Is that something which
that's the next step? I find it useful for people to kind of do this and then say, okay, exactly that. And so Rory, if you want to take that, why don't you take it and take that next step and you can talk through like, how do we abstract, and I can help take some notes.
All right, I'll give it a shot. You mean later on, right?
No, right. Yeah. I think we're, as people are working, I think we've got a number of things here. And I think, yeah, my next step was to say, okay, now that we see this, how do we abstract out what's in the yes? At least let's talk about yes and no, and then we can kind of edge into maybe, because I don't think there's a clear answer, but I think if there's some clear guidance about what are those components of that we think about with facility, then I think, folks can leave the room happy. So go for it, Rory.
Well, I mean, okay, this is just random brainstorming, right? But so for example, if you take an institution that's like CERN, that's clearly, well, that's an organization. Well, then there's also the issue of organizations versus facilities versus equipment, which is probably an oversimplification. So one way of, again, I'm just brainstorming, okay? One thing we might do is to kind of try to put it on a spectrum, from organization at one end being the most organizational for which you would use Aurora, and then at the other end of the spectrum would be a single piece of equipment, and then something like an animal facility would be somewhere in the middle, a core facility would be somewhere in the middle. You get the idea. and then that would give us some way of grouping to some extent a spectrum, and then we could then say, all right, what are the properties of a few core properties of each of these that are relevant to this question of each of these things. That would be an exercise, and we don't have time to do that today, but that would
Well,
be
we
an
have this
exercise
here,
that we
right?
could
I mean,
do.
I'm going to argue that's kind of what people have already done, right? That, if I just duplicated the slide, except maybe for Diamond Light, but like field stations, permanent infrastructure, those are all organizations. Centers, we've got the CERN data center, beamlines. Center is not quite the right word. Center is like something, it's not an organization. So like sub part of org. You've got animal facilities, core instruments. Yeah, there you go. See, stuff starts to move around. I don't know what BLT is. I'm sorry. Core instrumentation facilities go here. There's other examples. So there's, it changes a little bit based on this example that you're talking about, Rory. Is what spreading it out by. I would argue that a field station is an organization. But equipment, I guess many of them are like parts of Berkeley, for example, data slice. So I guess that,
where
yeah,
a university has field stations.
exactly.
That's
right.
where I was thinking it's a sub part.
Yeah. Right. And I think the question there, right, is like, and back to Rory, is this the appropriate vector to put everything on? Is it based on, and should it be based on whether something is a subpart of an organization? Because one could also argue that Oak Ridge National Lab is a subpart of Department of Energy, right? And so do we then class it as a center or a subpart of an organization, or can still be considered a facility? I see somebody with a hand in the room. Go for it.
Yeah, this is David Elbert from Johns Hopkins. I'm not really sure why we need to distinguish organizations and facilities, like what end value we get from that. Roar's already let us have organizations have sub-organizations, and so I think we run the risk of confusing the issue, misusing what is produced without a compelling reason. So if somebody could articulate to me the compelling reason to have those different levels, I'm all ears.
Yep. So if we did org plus suborg, this could go over here.
Hi, Laurie. We're just gradually moving up the row. Partly an answer to you, David, and partly in like the way I've been processing and thinking some of it. So in the Zoom chat, I've put Roar's definition of what is eligible, and also
that's coming. That's coming. Good for it.
But also the second part of that is what isn't eligible. So, and I think that's really helpful too, right? In the same way that we say, these are the things that are being described, then these are also the things that are out of scope for this particular thing, so we need to think about them a different way. So I think if you look at, if you're looking for a ROAR and you're a single person consultancy, you're not going to get one because you're not a mostly autonomous entity. That's,
right. And so we'll put this here. And so what I would say right now is we're jumping ahead a little bit and making the assumption that ROARs are the only PID that we want here. But I think to your point is that if we are thinking about vectors, ROAR provides a reason why we might want to vector on kind of organization type and component. So I get your point, but I don't, I'm not going to say prima facie that ROAR is the end all be all for PIDs for facilities.
Sorry, Laura. And that wasn't my point. Wasn't let's use ROARs. My point was it's useful to think about what is and what isn't in scope, and the things that aren't in scope are sometimes at least as useful and helpful in kind of defining things as that. That was
100%. Yeah. Other folks in the room.
I mean, I believe for me, the distinction between organization and facility is not so difficult. An organization is a body that has working contracts, that has a human resource department, and all that stuff. So an organization operates facility. Facility is more the hardware stuff that sits in the lab, and that is being used. Whereas the organization is the thing, say, the entity that operates this facility.
Mm,
But where I have much more problems is with the distinction between instrument and facility.
yep.
Because there I don't see that boundary very clear.
Okay. Hang on.
I mean, adding to that, obviously the difficulty comes since we have organizations whose only purpose is to run one particular facility. And then you tend to confuse both. But still you have an organization, which is an administrative body, and you have a piece of hardware that is doing research.
Right. Right. And I think, I guess the question back to you is how important is it that one makes the distinction here, right? Is it okay for something to be both a facility and an instrument, or both an organization and a facility? Do we have to have a separate PID for those, or can we use this piece of metadata to distinguish it?
And we also have organizations that have organizations within them.
Correct.
I have 3 roars for organizations that are underneath the university, which is an organization. So
right.
I think that there will always be complicated cases. So, and then to Rolf's point, we will argue a lot about what constitutes an instrument. And I have in many workshops where someone will put a microscope on the table, and it is an instrument to an outside observer until you're an expert using that microscope. And when you change the method of operation of that microscope, it is now another instrument. It does completely different things. Same at a beamline. When you configure the hutch differently, it is now a different instrument in many people's eyes. And so it is sometimes has to be left to the eyes of the beholder, I think.
Well, I think it's just a thought. I think it's also very much related to how this identifier will be used, like in which workflows used by whom. To me, an instrument identifier is much more closer to the research processes. Like these identifiers are likely to be used by the researchers to manage their workflows, to identify in their, for example, experimental protocols, and I would say I use this particular piece of instrument to derive this set of data, while like facility is much farther away from that process. That's probably the conceiving of an entire research project, so which facility will be using and apply that resources for. That is where this identifier will come into the to various systems.
So that's where those use cases become really important, it sounds like. Okay. All right. We will own the PID and update it. Yep. Awesome. Very true.
So I guess the question is whether we want to use the same identifier system to in these very different processes.
Yep. Yep. Right. And I'm wondering is it the identifier itself that matters, or is it the metadata on the record associated with the identifier that matters? Like, do we use the identifier to determine if something's a facility? Do you know what I mean?
Okay, hi, it's Adam again, and then Rolf wants to talk too,
Okay.
because we can't put our hands up in Zoom. Just on that question about whether it's the identifier that matters or whether it's kind of like the workflow, I think as you just pointed out, the use cases here are really important to kind of inform that thing, because part of what the way we are again defining both an organization, a facility, and an instrument are how we kind of conceptually think they sit within a research workflow, right? So
Right.
part of the question has an answer in what kind of way are we using this information? What kind of processes and practices are the information associated with? And I think that's probably part of what we actually need to define rather than just defining the terms institution, facility. But, you know, Rolf.
Yeah, since we were involving PIDs in the discussion, I mean, we already do have PIDs for instruments, and so maybe useful exercise would be to question whether these PIDs for instrument can already used right away for facilities.
Yep.
And if you shake your hand, then please explain me why not. And this answer will then bring on us to the distinction between facilities and instruments.
Yep.
Of course, this is just one use case, but in bioimaging, we have facilities with zillions of instruments. So, for example, we have 20 instruments. You cannot put them together as a one instrument. It makes no sense. So you distinguish individual instruments, and you have a facility. There was a use case to track the impact of the facility or somehow to distinguish. I'm not saying this is important to use identifier for it. I don't know. That's not the thing. But the instrument is something in this particular case, it is completely different from a facility. It is. The facility is a unit which which owns several instruments, and you want to distinguish which instrument was used in. Someone said it that in a protocol or in a method, but not the facility. You don't care as a researcher much about the facility.
Okay.
So sorry if I direct answer to that. In the PID and schema, we do have the has component and is component of. So we do have that hierarchy built in. So that is not completely a counter argument. But having heard that, maybe we come to a distinction property if you say an instrument is something that can be used independently of other instruments. And because in your example of a facility, you will use an instrument in that facility without using all the others.
Yes, exactly. So it's not a component of, yeah? It's not true. It's, I'm using this particular instrument and I don't discuss about any other piece of equipment which is around. This is how you use this particular facility, yeah? Of course, then you have facilities which have a very complex system, which is kind of one instrument, which all depends on each other. Yeah, in the bioimaging facility, I don't care about the electron microscope if I use a fluorescence microscope. Yeah, it's absolutely 100% unrelated information.
Got it.
This also applies to cases where we clearly speak of instruments, because a complex instrument has many sensors, and in each of those measurements, you only would use a subset of those. So, but I guess we are on the right track, that the distinction property is the independent use of something.
And I'll add that there are instruments that are not represented in this room that are really complicated, like planes that fly around with different sensors and do things, and are in some sense part of an organization and may themselves be a facility or a ship. And so other working groups, when we have representatives from them, we always find something that is new and complicated, and is not only the instruments, but how far apart you same in a hutch, where how far your detector is in some X-ray methods will matter, and how far apart you put geophones will matter, and where they are temporally, because when you're flying an instrument in a plane, the readings change because it is moving. So I think that each type of domain will bring us complicated things. I think the idea that the use case drives it is critical, and I think that there are two use cases that, of all the ones I hear, that are the principal use cases, and they are not necessarily aligned. One is what you do with the data, the science, if you will, that comes from the data is a critical part, and what most scientists in the room think of. And the other is what has been flowing from the funder. The person who runs a core facility or something like that needs metrics on what has been used and ways to track where the data goes and what the impact is, and has a responsibility to structure their organization or their facility based on what the funding organization thinks they are.
Mm-hmm.
You can do it with PIDs, but it's not always the appropriate thing because of its name. The schema will accept it, I agree. But I mean, we have something that I serve, one of my roles is Chief Data Officer for the Materials Innovation Platform called Paradigm. It is, to most outside observers, a user facility distributed across 2 institutions. However, the National Science Foundation wanted something more than a user facility, so they came up with the term platform. So it links both the instruments and the expertise of the people that work there, and so there will always, and they had to do that for a variety of complicated reasons. So I think really being sure to focus on, okay, let's narrow things down, or we have too much scope. Narrow things down to what are the 2 use cases or 3 use cases we can really serve, and what's a good way to structure it. My suggestion.
Yep. Okay, I'm gonna get this down to 12 here. We got some great notes. Other comments? I'm running out of space on my slides.
Sorry if that distorts in the dialogue, but just wondering, Mark, it was an important thing you said that is not appropriate to do. And what we are trying to do here is to turn that is not appropriate into, say, objective properties that we can define.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge when you're working in fuzzy spaces, is how do you create something that's flexible enough that allows for these, you know, they're not edge cases. They're, you know, life isn't binary and it doesn't fit into neat categories. So how do we develop a schema that allows for that, you know, distribution along and within and among and, you know, many different trajectories. So, all right. We got some good ideas here. Lots of stuff on the page. I wanted to move on. I'm looking at the time. We have actually plenty of time. Are there other folks in the room who have something to say, or folks online that would like to add something here? All right. All right. We're going to move to the next slide. And if folks still have some ideas back on the, I added these 2 things you just said here, what to do with the data and what's been flowing. I think a lot of these use cases can be kind of loosely categorized under those 2 headers. So I get it. I love it. If you folks have other ways they want to think about organizing this list or adding stuff to this list, please go ahead and do so. At the same time, for those of us who like to look at many things at once, we're going to move to the next slide, which is what PIDs should facilities use. And in this particular case, we're going to talk through the example of ROR. I'm going to come back to what, you know, has been said in the room already, including the use case, the PIDs use case, and the particular use case that Adam presented earlier, that I'm not advocating that ROR is the end-all be-all for facilities. I'm asking us to explore how well ROR can be used, and kind of what the next steps are as we think about what persistent identifiers can be used for facilities, and what the needs of the community are to be able to support this fairly wide range of use cases we have here. So we have a slide. I'm going to go through it. I am not an expert on ROR at all, and I'm not, like I said, I'm not trying to advocate one way or another. I'm just starting us off in a conversation here. So as we know, ROAR can and does, and Adam shared that before, support identification of and use cases for facilities that align with their scope and inclusion criteria. As Adam noted earlier, ROAR is primarily focused on global high-level organizations. It does allow for sub-organizations. However, its scope is really on organizations that researchers cite as either an affiliation, so where do I work, or as a funder who is providing money for me to do my work. So that's their scope. And I think if we think just about that scope, there's a number of use cases that we just talked about where folks are considering things facilities that don't fit into that scope. It's not an affiliation. And it's maybe might fit into the funder piece, but I really think it's more about, can somebody actually say they're affiliated with this facility? And I think that's where things start falling apart a little bit, is with that scope. And I'm not advocating that board change its scope. I think this is really useful for organizations to have a very clear scope, but it also means that it could be for facilities that we're using more than one persistent identifier, and we're going to have to rely on schema to ensure that the type of organization is carried through. So the piece I was looking at, ROAR schema does include a types field. And I think I have another slide, my next slide here. Yeah, I was looking at DataCite, for example, and they do have part of their schema has a service field under resource type general that allows people to add things. And, it says an organized system of apparatus, appliances, staff, etc., for supplying some function required by end users. So one could imagine that a facility might fit in there. And so it might be that, where we go is say, look, you can use any number of PIDs, but as we are submitting data that is consumed by DataCite or Crossref or wherever, that there needs to be a metadata schema that allows for the specification that this thing that we're talking about here with this identifier is actually a facility. So I'm gonna stop talking because I think I've said something that is somewhat heretical, and just kind of turn this over to the room and see if we can get out of this room still smiling. So over to you guys to talk about, when we're talking about persistent identifiers, what do you think we should be doing here?
Regarding about RAWs, I really would say that is not appropriate. And I try to explain why. So RAW is for organizations. I'm coming from Helmholtz-Zentrum Berlin für Materialien und Energie. We are an organization and we operate as the synchrotron light source BESI2. BESI2 is not a sub-organization of HZB. BESI2 is not a department in there. BESI2 is a facility that is operated by HZB, and it is conceptually really a different thing. You never have a working contract with BESI. You have a working contract with HZB.
Got it.
So in your particular case, what's the point of speaking of a facility? Because in your very particular case, you do not speak of an administrative organizational unit. Yeah, facility, at least in my eyes, is something what is more in terms of organizational unit and not in terms, if I'm a active researcher with my research groups. If someone says to me, facility, it's an organizational unit. If someone says to me, Bessie, in this particular case, I didn't know that it's not an organizational unit, but I would primarily think of a synchrotron as an instrument. Yeah, so I would say the way we should distinguish things, and in your case is very, very specific, because I think in many, many cases, this is simply organizational unit, whatever it means, it's administrative issue.
I mean, lots of stuff from all of the organizational units at HZB work in one way or another for BESI. So that is so the facility is completely orthogonal to the organizational unit structure. So the unit structure, we have IT, we have human resources, we have all that thing that makes an organization. But the facility is completely orthogonal to all these structure. So it doesn't make sense to trying to squeeze the facility in that into organizational units.
Yep.
I think the first thing I say is shout out to people online. Please feel free to interrupt us. Otherwise, we'll just pass the microphone around the room. And, so,
I'm looking for comments. I haven't seen folks leaving comments. So
Sure.
yeah, I'll let you know if I see something.
So I think for me, again, as both somebody who did lots of kind of infrastructure admin at institutions and was also a researcher, the kind of three different things are, and again, this is not the actual PIDs themselves, but the kind of like concepts. An organization has things attached to it which are not necessarily to do with research. So an organization is the administration. I don't think I would ever think of a facility that has an HR department, right? And I think one of the things that kind of like disambiguates these for me is that an organization is kind of conceptually a greater whole than a facility. A facility might house one instrument, or a facility might house 2,000 rigs of something or other, and it might have staff, but it is dedicated to the purpose of the thing that it is doing. And so you could argue there's an edge boundary between IROs and facilities, but that I think is not quite the case. What you're really talking about here is a facility is kind of a housing for a particular either type of research or type of research instrument that then you would also then talk about characterizing the instrument or instruments inside. So for me, there's like a three-step container relationship where the instrument is the thing that is directly producing research output. The facility is a host for one or more of those things that are creating those research outputs, and itself may amalgamate and may have other processes, and that facility itself may be something. And then an organization would have facilities. So to me, that kind of like schema relationship and those kind of hierarchies make sense from the way that I have used things and the way that I have administered like links between things. Again, I think you could spend a bit of time arguing about kind of the actual semantics of that, but I think from a use case point of view, that kind of is probably the most grounded way to think about things.
Are facilities separate legal entities? Can they be legal entities?
Can't hear you. Whoever's talking, can't hear you. Thanks, Gabby.
I answered that they can be legal entities, and many are not. And in different countries, it will be different because there's no global law on that anyways.
All right, I see there's a dictionary entry here. So we're going to have fun and just do this because we can. The Cambridge Dictionary. There you go. A place, especially buildings where a particular activity happens. Wow, I didn't think about sports facilities. That's a great idea. You could have Lambeau Field in there.
Yeah,
And here you have buildings, equipment, and services. Yep.
I put the dictionary there just to check if we're drifted too far from the original meaning of the word, but I think the emphasis is on the utility of it. Like the core of a facility is usage, and I think that resonates with our use case driven conversation, semantics driven. So.
Got it. Okay, let me go back to where I was before. Where's my slides? There we are. Okay, so I like that, maybe useful, so we're going to do this.
I mean, just adding
usage.
one more comment. Maybe just adding one more comment. First of all, I agree with your hierarchical structure, but I guess it might be helpful to discuss in semantics. So an organization operates a facility. An instrument may be part of a facility. If we say formulate those RDF triples in order to define the relation between the terms that we are discussing, then we might be clearer on the definition.
Got it. Yep. Yep.
So you can be an instrument without being a member of a facility, and you should be able to be a facility without being a member of an organization. Many facilities, yours is a member of an organization. Well, is operated by, but there will also be facilities that are not operated by organizations.
In which
or is
case
that
they're an
both a
organization
facility and its
facility.
own organization?
Yeah, that is also an org. I think that's what it is. There's a facility that may also be an organization.
Can I move in a new direction?
Yes, you may.
So I put a thing on the shared slide. I really think about it mostly with instruments rather than with other things, but true for all of these things. My understanding is there is no PID available today that allows transfer of ownership, and by ownership I mean who gets to update the metadata. So when I mint a data site DOI, I have control of that, and then I'm supposed to update the metadata as it is needed, if it's PID inst or something else. I say this because with instruments, in an ideal world, to me, manufacturer would provide us with an instrument that comes with a PID. Probably a PID inst at this point in time is the only good thing we have. But then once I own it, if I then take that microscope and buy a new objective lens to add on to that turret, then I should, or a new detector in my hutch, then I need to update the metadata. The manufacturer is not going to do that. So that PID ownership should pass to me or somebody in the lab or something like that. And I think that this problem probably also goes up the food chain to facilities and organizations as well. I meant roars for organizations. Someday I'll be gone. Who knows what will happen to those roars? The big things don't change too much.
So I think the issue that you're stating is covered by both version of and by event data in things like the commons. So there are ways to update the information inside metadata without necessarily being the owner. And I think that that's something to think about. And also we'd have to consider about kind of like object things. But Gabby and Anna are here, so I won't speak too much about the actual things. But there are now second order identifiers, and the people who have already heard me go on about RAID can stop listening for a minute. But things where they talk about not just that instrument, but how that instrument is changed. You could link all those things together as part of the research activity identifier. You could timestamp all those things, and then that second order explicit piece of information. So it's, again, how you think about the information. We can go into how a ship is the same ship or a different ship, depending whether or not it has all the way. No, should we not do that right now? Okay. But capturing those kind of events and those kind of versions and those kind of things, I think is something which is important, but I think we are already kind of in the PID space, having different kind of ways of dealing with that now. Gabby, I don't know if there's something particular on the metadata data site thing.
No, but it's right. Yeah, am I talking on the microphone?
Yes, you are. Awesome.
Okay, sorry. No, it's true that with ROAR, you don't have ownership of your organization metadata record as you can have with a DOI. but yeah, maybe.
So
Yeah, I hear what
the
you're saying, yeah.
versioning and all, I completely agree with. We do that already. But what I'm saying is the only person who can actually make a new version or change that is the person who can log into in DataCite the repository. So I either have to give my login to someone else, or there's no field in the schema to say who maintains and who has the right to do that. Yeah.
Publisher is the metadata field that tells you who's responsible for that content or object.
But that doesn't answer the question, because the publisher is not necessarily the entity that has the update permission to the datasite record.
Yeah,
The
can I?
publisher is not necessarily has permission to update the dataset record.
But for example, if your organization registers a DOI for a microscope with a resource type instrument, your organization is the publisher, and you can make updates to that metadata record.
But you can also create event data in the commons, which is associated with that DOI, which has updates. So you can. Yep. And then it's up to the way that we handle that workflow as to how we, again, aggregate or consolidate that information. And validate, yeah. So the. Yeah, so one of the things, so I was working on some workflows for this for like green OA, where there were like papers in more than one repository, which is, you know, a pain where there's different kind of metadata and maybe the same DOI, or different DOIs, so it's so much fun. And the thing that you always need to do is ensure that the original publisher has the final kind of say over how that information is regarded. So there is still a role for the owner of that information, but anyone can create that event data, and that event data can be used, right? So how that works is something, and Gabby will now tell us.
Publisher needs to be an organization, so a legal entity, but we also have a contributor property in the metadata, and the definition of that is the institution or person responsible for collecting, managing, distributing, or otherwise contributing to the development of the resource. Contributor, yeah. For instruments, if there is an institution responsible for the management of the instrument, for example, the legal owner, the operator, or an institute providing access to the instrument, use the contributor type hosting institution for the owner of the instrument.
Yeah, but still, these are, say, DataCite properties and have nothing to do with the permission to update the DataCite record.
Can I? Sorry.
Only the owner of the prefix.
Yeah. Just on that point, who has how to update the metadata for that instrument? So like if you made a modification to that instrument, and it's used as a new, you know, for a new use case or a workflow, you can register like as a operator or responsible person or group for that instrument. You can register a new DOI and then link to the original DOI and say this is a new version of this instrument, and now you own that DOI, and then you can update that DOI metadata further. And the next person who made a modification to that, to your instrument, they can continue to, you know, have a new version of that, and they will own be the publisher of that DOI.
And they're linked by
So I just want to confirm that with DataSite, there is no way to organizationally transfer the ownership of DOIs. I know that within Crossref, say the journal goes from one publisher to another, we can transfer all of our DOIs and the ownership to another publisher. But there is not that method in DataSite. You have that method.
We also have the same workflow, but both organizations need to be obviously members of DataSite to take control and be able to update metadata.
But you wouldn't be able to do that for data sets. Say a repository went from NIST to commerce.
We have usually this for journals, for data repositories. I think it's the same.
Thank you. You actually can. You can't do it as a repository or datasite account, but the datasite person, I believe even the consortia can do it. So it's totally transferable, but there's still the issue that only one repository or account can edit the DOI, which is still a limitation, and not only for instrument. For example, even in an organization, the laboratory might have need to make specific edits like the landing pages. And so the current DataSite limitation should not prevent us to raising the need that we have to have several repositories or members able to modify the DOI. And just to come back to the event data, but Xiaoli will confirm or inform that I think with event data, you can only add relationships and not modifications to the DOI that would be relevant for the discussion there.
Yeah, that is right. That's like a relation with another identifier that goes into event data that get related to both identifiers.
Okay. Oh. All right. We have, I think, about 10 minutes left. I think we've got a lot of stuff going on here. This is awesome. I don't see, are you guys spent in the room there? Any other comments online? I don't see. I think what I'd like to understand in this last few minutes here, this next slide, 2 slides, sorry, the last slide. I think, there are still some remaining questions about facilities PIDs. A lot of it sounds like between facilities and instrumentation, as Rolf has been very clearly articulating, there is some need for flexibility, both in terms of, how do we capture the settings or changes in objectives, for example, like on a microscope, not objectives as in goals. How do we capture those changes in the PIDs? Who is allowed to change the PIDs, the PID metadata, pardon me. So there are some kind of remaining questions, items for discussion. I think the question that comes out of this discussion for me, and I think for us as a group here, is does it make sense to spin up a new RDA working group to discuss and develop recommendations here? Should there be, a second discussion about this at the next RDA meeting? Is there another place, maybe at PID-INS, that we talk about this? So this is kind of the last 10 minutes here is let's figure out if there is a next step, and if so, what is it? Because there's a lot of really interesting comments that came out of this, and I would like to respect the time of the people in this room and figure out if there's something that could be done, and if so, where, to kind of carry this to a place where we have a practical next step.
From being mostly an observer at the session and didn't have much opinions on the subject, it seems that establishing a clear definition of where we're going with facility, etc., are the next steps, and that maybe for this, it's easier to remain in an open interest group format so that it still produces outputs such as definitions and examples, but while being still open rather than very already focused on the recommendation working group.
Okay. Got it.
I think part of the question is there enough for a working group? Is it feel like, because it feels to me like this is something that is important, but it's not something we should be spending 18 months on, and the time to write a statement of work and all of that. So I'm wondering if it's something for a more defined task group or something else that we can constitute out of the interest group, where we have like at most one work package and a really clear kind of conceptual thing that's going to happen at the end of it. So instead of saying we need a working group, I would maybe say that PIDs needs to form a smaller, and I hate to use the word, but more agile kind of task group that says we are going to define facility within both use cases and some kind of semantics in between where we understand organization sits and where we understand instrument sits, to make sure that this kind of debate and the output from today is both respected and processed into something that we can then refer to. So
Fix that, Adam, if you're online. I think I wrote that wrong.
So are you advocating putting facilities into PID-INST, or a distinction, like pushing it that way, or pushing them towards ROR or data site DOI?
no, I'm sorry.
We need more mics.
Yeah. No, I'm proposing that we set up something that decides that, rather than, I think it's something that we could have, PID-INST could have some kind of ownership over as like a valid place to have that discussion. So I'm saying PID-INST could host that discussion, but it doesn't necessarily at that point say it's a PID-INST instrument, or it's a ROR, or it's a DOI with resource type and property things. But I think this might, and these kind of this bit of expertise is probably a good place to have that conversation.
Agreed, and can we all agree that we will not invent a new PID?
Yes. Yes.
Good. Well, we got somewhere.
97.
I'll put agreed here. Decision.
I mean, as somebody that has just been mentioned, so I'm a co-chair of the PID-INST working group, but I was not involved in organizing this session. I would
You were an instigator, Rolf. You were an instigator. You were part of the PID discussion at PIDfest earlier this year. You said we had to have this conversation. So you're an instigator.
No, yeah, I'm fine with that. No, I can take it as an action to discuss that with my fellow co-chairs.
Awesome.
And of course, we should keep in touch with a PID work. How do you call it? PID working with PIDs and tools working group, because you started that, and we shouldn't say take ownership of your thing. But
No, just to be clear, we are just hosting this discussion for this exact purpose. So we are not interested in taking ownership. We just provided a forum for the discussion. So.
yeah, as I said, at the moment I cannot make a commitment on behalf of PID-INST because I would need to discuss with my co-chairs. But of course, I can take it as an action to discuss it with my co-chairs.
Okay, well, to action. Sorry, I'll change it to action. Action. There we go. Awesome. Anything else that we've got that we should make clear as Rolf takes this forward? All right. Awesome. These slides are open. If you have some other ideas that come up after the session, they're still open. I know there's also a separate, what's it called? A separate notes document from here. It has been my pleasure to facilitate this. Thank you all for your comments. And I feel like there's a next step here and enough interest and ideas and clarity at some level here to take the next step forward and hopefully make a clear statement about what to do if you're a facility and are you a facility. So Raul, thank you for taking the action. And thanks everyone for participating. And you got 5 minutes to run to your next session, or I don't know exactly when they start. So enjoy and stay cool out there in Costa Rica, San Jose. Yeah, exactly, Chantel. Thanks all for a lively session. This has been fun.